Thank you. Opening opposition.
Rohan speaking first.
I'm sure everything's going okay.
Yeah, just need to mute it.
Okay, thank you. Opening opposition. And now for the team in closing government. Speaking first, Zena.
I'm taking
Closing opposition.
I'm Mark speaking member, no preference. And Jack with no preference.
All right, thank you to all the teams who have introduced themselves. As you know, there are a lot of observers in this room. I would like to remind everyone to please be quiet during the debate. I know that some things might be funny. I know that you all have very insightful and intellectual thoughts. However, please keep those whispers at an absolute minimum to make sure that everyone can hear all the speakers in the round. That being said, without further ado, I'd like to invite the first speaker from Opening Government to open up this debate. Here.
Is everybody ready? Yeah, great. I want to make from the start the trade-off in this debate very clear. I think this policy has tremendous benefits, both to national leagues, to lower leagues, to national teams, to the economy of these countries, and to player development and lower tier leagues. I also think this policy comes at an incredibly small cost. That is, some top-tier Brazilians go to Saudi Arabia instead of playing on top-tier teams in Europe sometimes. I don't think this is a significant trade-off in comparison to the benefits we'll get on our side, and I'll explain why in just a moment. What is the framing in this debate? I think this debate is about inclusion in your starting lineup, meaning you probably need about 10 players from national leagues, national origin in your squad originally. We recognize this debate is about a minimum of 5 domestic players in the starting lineup, but by necessity, this means you'll need to be more domestic players throughout your squad. And the reason for this is because you need to be able to replace players in your squad on a short notice, because you need to be, due to injury, you need to build the physical infrastructure to have more of these people to maintain the continuity of presence of people at the height in this at the top league to a significant degree, and we're happy to stand behind that on our side of the house. What is the principled rationale behind this policy, and why is this important? I recognize that this policy represents discrimination, right? That is to say, we are excluding some people who, by virtue of talent, might otherwise make it into the squad, and allowing other individuals who may be less talented and may actually likely be less talented to have a spot at top-tier leagues and in things like La Liga and in things like Benelux leagues and so on and so forth. What is the logic behind this? We think the logic underscores the same. I believe things like affirmative action are just. We trade off these kinds of benefits because we believe there's a benefit for inclusion of other groups of people at the top tier within leagues and in other spaces in society, even if it means that the absolute best or absolute most important or absolute most talented people don't always rise to the top. We also carve out exceptions for protected classes in many instances throughout academia and throughout the professional world to safeguard against these kinds of things. But we also think that this is just for a second principled reason, and that is because these clubs have often built their brands and traded on their names for years. That is, built their economic empires and legacies on the basis of being by and for local people. Because those local individuals are the people who helped make those clubs valuable by allowing those clubs to capitalize on a brand that was present in the community. The reason these brands are valuable is because of the history of the club, because of the history of the community. That is, teams like Basque teams build their brand on Basque nationalism and localism, where teams like Man United build their brand on a history of English pride and things like this, for example. These teams have built their brand for years on this, traded on their name on this, and this is a rationale for many fans to buy into supporting the club in the first place. We think, therefore, a reciprocal obligation exists for the team to do what is not just best for themselves in the abstract and profit maximized, but also do what's best for the nation that gave birth to them, and the nation that proffers them. The final claim I want to make here is that I think this stands independent of practical outcomes. So I think even if there's some other harm that opposition can forward beyond excluding some people arbitrarily from participation on these clubs, I think we're standing ahead on that. The second claim I want to make is why we have massive benefits to teams in lower leagues, because I think this debate has an impact that goes far beyond teams at the top tier that play in like the Premier League, for example, and things like this. Why is this the case? There are two reasons for this. Firstly, I think we get vastly better financing on our side of the house for these lower tier teams. That is because if you are a good young English or Scottish player, you now have a premium placed on you. This means you can be sold to teams in higher tiers at a significantly greater amount of money, and you can make a lot of money off of this that you otherwise can't do on their side of the house. This means that for teams that are currently financially pretty strained, where revenue is uncertain, and if you're relegated, you don't make as much money, you don't get into Europe, you don't make as much money, what this means is you decrease the volatility in financing that exists for these teams in the status quo. But moreover, the trade-off in amount of money means that now they can allocate that additional funds to developing more coaches, to developing more trainings, to developing more programs to improve their talents overall, and to ensure that their financial system remains less volatile. We think that's generally good. But the second thing I think you do is you make lower tier leagues less monopolistic, right? So it's harder for a single team to buy all of the best players up at the higher tier rather. Why? In our worst case, where all of these teams still attempt to do this and buy up as many good players as they can from the national squad, this is still great for people like dev squads in Germany, for example, and more wealthy nations that do have the capacity to attempt to do this. But I don't think teams do have the capacity to do this, right? Because why would you be willing to spend a ton of money on like the 9th or 10th national player who might or might not replace the starter in some instances, as opposed to diversifying away and spending those resources elsewhere? So we have inbuilt incentives to diversify away on our side of the house that we think are significant. This has a massive benefit to both those leagues at the top then, who diversify, and massive benefits to lower leagues who make more money, hire better coaches, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. The second claim I want to make here is that we're vastly better for youth development on our side of the house. There are a few reasons for this. Note that in the status quo, the biggest clubs like Man United are the least likely to engage in player development right now. Why? Insofar as you have an incentive to win now, your time horizon is shorter than the time horizon that exists for other clubs and other individuals. That is to say, you might actively want them to develop, but you need to trade that off against developing players now who have sufficient talent to play in the leagues now, rather than building tomorrow's talent, and so on and so forth. Insofar as that is true, there's a much greater incentive to put money where you know you have a guaranteed return rather than the future. So this creates an inbuilt incentive to always shelve this into the future. What that means then is on our side of the house, two things change. Firstly, this creates an incentive at every level within leagues to do a better job at youth development at the national level, because now you know you need a constant incentive to have 5 players in your starting league at all periods of time. But not only this, you get a redirection of funds on the balance away from other priorities, right? So insofar as now you're trading off resources that would otherwise go into recruiting the 8th or 9th Brazilian player who you can recruit from to play in Europe, you're now putting that money into those local developments. The benefits are threefold. Firstly, economic, right? You just get massive revitalization of resources, football coaches, fans who are coming, people who are playing, talent that you have to move into that country to develop significantly more at the lowest level. But secondarily, you get significant benefit to those development squads. Now you have significantly greater pool of talent coming up from the ground to a massive degree. Before I go on and explain the impact on fans and national teams, I'll take a closing.
Why not have a requirement about recruiting people from the suburb or the city rather than the country?
We may well do other things, and we're perfectly happy to stand by other requirements. That's fine. In theory, if you want to prop something not mutually exclusive, Harish can happily deal with that. What are the other impacts within the round? I think there's a massive impact on fans as well that I think is significant in this debate. That is because fans have a significant connection to local talent. That is to say, these are often the people who watch lower tier teams, who watch youth leagues and things like this, who have enjoyed seeing these teams play for years and years, often have a nationalist connection to these things, and insofar as they think that's incredibly important, they enjoy seeing those teams play. When they enjoy seeing those teams play, they probably enjoy it far more and probably derive far more sense of enjoyment when they can relate to that player in the field. When they can look up and see that kid from my small town is now playing in Old Trafford and he's doing his best and he's fighting alongside the very greatest in the league. I think that's an incredible benefit to those fans who now see that. I think that's something we get on our side of the house that they just don't do by virtue of not being able to do that policy. The second thing I think that this does is it's much better for national teams. The reason this is important is because nation states derive a vast amount of enjoyment from watching their national teams play. This is the reason Germany says the only time they can feel patriotic is when they play in the World Cup, for example. At the point at which you have significantly greater local talent development at the national level, you now have significantly stronger national teams for a fairly intuitive reason. I think this is good for national pride and celebration, which I think is an inherent good insofar as we think everybody derives a sense of identity and fulfillment from expressing their nationality and enjoying that insofar as they have a real preference to do so. But I think it's also good in terms of the quality of those games, which has amplificative benefits onto the enjoyment that fans have otherwise. Because we are better for fans, better for the economy of teams, and better for the economy of the leagues, I'm incredibly proud to stand at the opening hour.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. Now invite her on the leader of opposition to use the case for OO. Here. Thank you, observers, for being nice and quiet. Good job.
A little bit of stress. Okay. Oh shit, I can see my own live stream. Oh, this is so weird. Sorry. That's just
You can also look at us.
wait, hopefully this doesn't break it. Sorry, this is really stressful. If this does break everything, I'm sorry in advance. Okay. Three, two, one. Go. For most of us who don't really give a fuck and debate, football doesn't mean that much. We could be watching a variety of other sports, and the margin of most of their cases is fairly small for that reason. I think for the people that this really matters is that football is a lot more than the arbitrary who won or who lost. It's the thing that you do where you go to the pub on a Sunday evening or a Saturday afternoon. It's a thing where you go in your community, you see your community week in, week out. And I think insofar as that's true, I think we have a very strong principled right to control. That is, some authoritarian government can tell me who is and isn't for my community and who decides to represent me is something abhorrent for the very reason Matt weirdly preempts his own case for. I'm going to provide a very simple principled explanation of this, and then we'll run the rest of the stuff and engage with the slightly sus econ that OG tries to run. The first thing, I think that football isn't a hugely profitable enterprise for the vast majority of cases, for the simple reason there is a top-down aggregation of funds and casual fans pull in. But for the people who it really matters, for the people who turn in, week out, who turn up to be unprofitable, who reinvest into their club at the expense of generating profits, those small leagues, they also tend to be majority owned by the people who play within the community. You know, in some places this is legislated and regulated, but in the vast majority of cases, even if owned by private owners, the reason you're watching this, not Man United, is because you care about the community. And so owners tend to let you make the decisions. They let you be in charge of the club, the managing role. They let you decide who's on the starting lineup. And I think fundamentally we have a principled right to control this. Insofar as I think I have a principled right to access my community, I have a right to shape how that community is formed and who gets to be in it. And I think the arbitrary distinction of where the people in my community was born is not a qualifying factor for this. And I think this is particularly important. I think this extends much further because I could BS the state power principle at you, and then I'm sure Harish would know all the correct rebuttal. But I think what's more nuanced and what's much stronger is the kind of way in which this plays in people's preference. And I think there are three much stronger justifications than the right to vote if we have it. The first is on the hardness of the preference. I would posit for the vast majority of working class families, it's difficult to tell the difference between a very slight centre-left, centre-right government, the one meaningless ballot that you push in. But when the frequency is every week, when you make the decisions of the monthly thing, when you make sure you get your kids through the thing, this is something that's really meaningful and it's very tangible. But secondarily, this isn't significantly more important. There is an irony when you see and you check, and like Wolverhampton prefer to like win Premier League or like win Champions League over like, you know, reversing who won the election. I think the nuance is that for many fans, this is a strong and hard preference. An opening government is going to hard run utilitarianism, but I think there's more to life than homo economicus. I think the vast majority of us make decisions that are more nuanced than that. Secondly, this is important.
On that.
Let's engage. No, thanks. I'll ask you at some point. Secondly, this is important. I think the real nuance of this principle is that it gets around a lot of the opening government preemption. Because think about what their preemption is. Their preemption is, but for the purpose of inclusivity, for the purpose of choice of that community. And then they run the interesting minority code. But the only reason you have that is because you're upset with the way in which the selection process works. Insofar as the selection process is self-determined, this is non-contingent on the preemption framed by Matt. Second thing I want to engage with is the funding argument. Don't let OG BS you with 3 minutes of hyperspeed here. What they're basically saying is this. We should somehow preference arbitrarily drawn state budgets because somehow they benefited off the reparative act. How have they benefited? By pulling mass amounts of funding in, by pulling in people every year to come watch the game, by pulling people into Arsenal. They would have to somehow show there was an economic damage these cities generated, and therefore the reparative obligation was shown, which is why that principle sounds real fucking whack. The second thing I think is more justified in this is the nuance of the case. Because think for a second why it is that we pull so many players from Brazil, okay? I think there are three things that are happening. The first is think about all the young players who are pushing for the Premier League, who are going to have their dreams crushed by this policy. Think about all the players who are playing for spots that aren't going to exist tomorrow morning. Think about all the families who are depending on livelihoods you're going to cut out. And these are significantly more vulnerable people. And this is an irreversible harm in comparison to the government, because these things that haven't happened yet. Second thing, this nuance, is the pool of size. Because just as OG said, that was the person playing. The truth is, Brazil is a lot fucking larger than the people who live in that centralized London community. Whilst to some degree I can empathize. The people watching in Brazil, watching back on the Europeans, I think I am happy and proud to see them on the spot. And I am happy with this. So I think that we win on this metric too. But thirdly, and this is crucial, think about this, because I think that OG tries to preempt and concede and get around the issue. There is an economic scale issue here. When there is interest in pooling talent, you turn to places where it's cheapest to build a stadium to find goods. Because the truth is, I don't think people are suddenly bored with the magic yet. You need to sift through players. The way that you do that is you build stadiums, you get kids to play, you get them to start up the community, you set up essential community structures, because you set them up in two key areas. The first are those underfunded, underprivileged areas where it's cheapest to build, which tends to be the developing world. It's the small playing stadiums that exist in Tanzania. It's the fact that you can see signs like Arsenal written in little when you go down small streets in Kenya. And the reason for this is essential. It means we're depriving the community access, because the incentive to invest in it is only insofar as you can find the short-term talent. But there's a final layer to this argument. Because in the long term, what happens when you generate significantly strong enough talent acquisition is you strengthen the local leagues in these areas. Because when you generate a strong enough community, it produces an excess of players. It is true. There is an excess of players. These excess of players turn. As people form a culture around football, people want to see their own league play. And this creates the funding. And often what happens is these large teams provide it for them. There's a reality that Arsenal sponsors many small leagues. The league that I used to watch weekend in, weekend out when I grew up in Zanzibar was one that was sponsored and funded by a European league. There is a reality that the people on the ground who experience a strong feeling of community for something that's a sporting activity they wouldn't get anywhere else, where it is the most exclusive, where it is the most comparative. These are the places that really matter. I'll take a point from Open. They have one.
Yeah, so a lot of your case seems to hinge on the belief that these clubs are community run. Other than asserting that, which doesn't seem intuitively true the vast majority of cases, do you have any explanation as to why that would be true?
So I gave you 3 methods to start. The first method I gave you was an explanation of the fact that unprofitable and there's a low corporate interest in investing them, which makes it likely that people own them for cooperative reasons. The second thing was a historical example. The vast majority of clubs were formed not before it was profitable, back before TV was popular, but there was a strong incentive money. So most people who own this own it by de facto on the fact that it was a club that you signed into, much like other sporting clubs and other sporting events that aren't strongly popularized. I picked golf. That sounds very elitist. Thirdly, and I think crucially there, this is what's okay. I think that preemption they give us is very weird. They go, the players won't move to the Saudi league. So I think I have 2 responses. The first, fuck yes they will, and yes they are, because I think the mechanism you give isn't sufficient. It's just mitigation of the truth. I think insofar as the funding that, I would posit that significantly less. My deputy will weigh this. But second, there are other alternatives. There's a reality. If you take all the most profitable clubs and you tell them, hey, you're going to get rid of your players, they're going to start their own leagues like they did in the Super League. And you know what's different this time? This time the fans abuse them. This time the fans, it's like, how dare these European leagues impose these rules on us? How dare they try and decide who is for us? Because they already support the players in the team. Because when they hear the story of these players, they will never hear others. When they hear the story of the poor player who has to go back to Brazil, they are going to want this, which means 2 things. Firstly, you create a closed league depth system where leagues continually stay in like the NBA or the NFL, which is you never get the moving up and down, you never get the talent side. Instead of the priority is not on pushing all this funding out. The second crucial thing, this is again essential, that this only happens on our side. It only happens when you get that fan support. The backlash never happens. I think this is a clear OO win. Thank you very much. This has been very fun.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. Now calling on the Deputy Prime Minister to close off the case for opening government. Here.
Opening opposition agrees that the way in which we should regulate sport should depend on what is in the interests and preferences of fans. They are incorrect in saying that is the status quo in the vast majority of places. With the partial exception of Germany, I cannot think of a top league where there are prohibitions on who can own the team. And there's a few intuitive reasons for this. One, I just want to appeal to reason and fact, and if you think about who actually owns these teams, US investors do so. That is not necessarily because they are profitable on a day-to-day basis, but they increase in capital value. Such that you think in 10 years, as streaming revenue and television revenue increases, you have a more valuable asset. It is true, they started as fan-owned teams, but that doesn't mean someone else did not buy them up. And if sports clubs aren't profitable and indeed loss-making, do they really believe the local community is the one who's often providing the funding for it? I think it's just an implausible characterization as to what the status quo looks like. And indeed, just got one final point. Even in lower leagues, what you probably end up with is an individual, maybe at best in a local community, who really likes the idea of owning that sports team, who is then still making the decision that is distinct from what the fans would want. Why does all of that matter? Because we care about what the fans want. We think this kind of regulation on the part of UEFA is probably a good idea. So just a couple points related to that. Why do we think that we should be preferencing domestic players? And this is irrespective about what fans want. The first claim I want to make on this is that we have a collective action problem in the way these leagues operate, such that domestic players from top countries with top and rich leagues are often actually excluded. What do I mean by that? Because if every single team, you're effectively competing with other teams. You're competing with them for on-the-field success, which also translates to sporting success. If you win and if you lose, impact on being relegated, i.e. how much revenue you get. But if you end up in the Champions League, UEFA Cup, or European competition, what does that then mean? that if any team decides to prioritize domestic players, particularly young domestic players who are yet to be yet to either reach their peak, who've shown their talent or have the experience to be able to compete at the top level, they will lose out comparatively to all others. As a result, if one team decides not to do that, other teams will need to do that. But the overall consequence then is domestic young players are, unless they are extraordinarily talented from a young age, shut out of the market. That is the affirmative action analysis, effectively, which we get from that. The second claim which we want to make on this is local fans actually really do care about these players. Why? Now, I do think it's probably fair that they care probably most about players from their own local area rather than just the country. But a couple of notes on this. One, when you have local development, it's probably players largely from your own local area. It's not exclusively from your local area. So this is a relatively good proxy for the people you care more about. Secondly, there's a reasonable catchment area. This is a practical application of the principle here. Maybe you want people who are exactly like you. That's not really very realistic. But people you are more likely to have a connection with. That gives you all the reasons why that is actually important to the sports fan. When you're looking at that individual, you know, like, that's someone who can be like me, someone who is like me. But more importantly, it is often someone who I think has the same values and cares about me and cares about the country in the same way I do. And finally, if they are from your nation, you're less worried about them leaving. That is why we think this is then justified on principle. Let's secondly then talk about player development and why that is benefited as a result. So there's a really interesting point which we get from opening opposition, which is there's a trade-off here. There's two trade-offs which we suggest. One is that Brazilian player who instead just has to go to Saudi Arabia. I don't think that's really an important constituency. They're going to do great in either side of the house. The more important one is, do you create a training academy in Kenya, for instance? Well, first, I actually don't think many clubs do that anyway. It's an awful lot of money for a very small chance of there ever to be any kind of player which is coming from it. And you still don't think there'll be like 10 or 20 players who are going to be coming from this. So I'm not sure they even have the counterfactual. There is actually a huge issue here. But if, for instance, that is something which is valuable, you would still do it on either side of the house because you still want your other 6 players to be great. You still want those other marketable assets to be great. So I just don't think there's a big change from what they are looking at. Now let's actually look at what happens to these domestic leagues and actually what's even better for communities. Because the worst thing for a local community is that your club fails financially. Opening opposition is right that lots of football clubs are not financially successful. One of the reasons why they're often in precarious financial positions is because their revenue base is in and of itself uncertain. That is because it is often very much dependent on your success, which even in the best cases will be probabilistic. You can win, you can lose, and it's quite difficult to know which one of those is going to happen. In that world, what is really useful is there's an alternative source of financing. What is that alternative source? So in your lower league Premier League club, your lower league club, you want to be you develop a player. The fact that that player is now worth more because other clubs in higher up divisions in your league have to pay more for that player because they have a premium attached to that you really need that in your team is a great source of revenue, which means that clubs both have a large incentive to start, even lower league clubs, to develop these players. But when that money actually comes in, it is great for the club to try and ensure that they are more likely to be successful. And this isn't just then about the absolute best players, it is also about the place slightly below that, because you do need more than the 5 in order to make sure you have a competitive squad. Go ahead.
Are Europeans discriminated against?
Are Europeans discriminated against? Depends on the country. This is a very odd question. It's a very broad question. Depends on the country. In the case of football, younger players who have talent do not get the opportunities which they should get, because effectively you are not being put in the first team, which you're more likely to. You're first not getting the training because clubs aren't willing to put the same kind of upfront cost, upfront spending attached to it. Secondly, even in the cases where you are not giving them the experience in that first team, which you are much more likely, because you think you are more likely to lose as a result. Finally, then, let's talk about national team success, which I do think is vital in this debate, and it is worth just stressing why it matters. If anyone was here in 2021, or when England was in the Euro 2020 final, you can just see how different the reaction is for people in the country. It actually brings people together when their national team ends up with ends up being successful. success is always compared to what your expectations are. So in the UK, in England, it might be about actually reaching the final, do really well, but it actually changes the way people interact with each other. The idea that when our team is more successful, we feel more unified because we're a point of unification. It is effectively the idea, the similarity and commonality between me and someone else is about that sports team. This is a model which means that all teams will have to considerably more effort to ensure those players are developed, to ensure they gain more experience, and as a result, national teams across Europe will do comparatively better than otherwise would. At the end of this debate, this is principally good. It is good for fans, it is necessary for players, and it is great for development and the finances of football. We're very happy to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. Now calling on the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close off the top half. Please, your chair.
Oh, this is really fun. Wow. Can I just very briefly take 2 minutes to say something? I think historically I am the first ever person coming out of the Ukrainian circuit to have broken LSE Open in the Open final. But the thing is, I'm definitely nowhere near being the best Ukrainian debater. There is much, much more than them. And unfortunately, a lot of them are currently soldiers. A lot of them are unable to participate in debates because they're putting all of their resources and their lives on the line for something that has been going on for 2 years and for 10 years. So I just want this speech and potentially other future speeches to be in honor of them and the years and their youth and the lives and the skill they have given up to not be here. There are very many teams across Europe, and we cannot just say that the big team like Arsenal or Chelsea is incredibly representative of how European teams operate. You can say that there's tens of teams out on the outskirts of Paris. You can look at how like the Premier League in England gets reshuffled pretty much every year, where some random Welsh team will pop up and just like exist. Doesn't mean they're owned by Qatar or Saudi Arabia or the Americans. It means that there are still these emerging or smaller clubs that exist within this framework, and negating their existence entirely and saying, oh yeah, they don't exist, therefore the whole case doesn't exist, is insufficient to be said on the side of OG. Second of all, we need to understand that even in the cases where this is not directly owned by the community now, this is still heavily associated with the community, which is what OG themselves say. This means that the community still has the certain right to decide who represents them and what kind of community they are. So the reason why this is played on us, I will basically go over this later. Second thing they try to attack us is that you want other players to be great, therefore you will still set up camps in the developing world and everything will be the same. They also tell you that you don't just need the 5 players, you need there to be backup players, that you always have, you always be working within the framework of this rule. That means that the incentive for you to find this talent and to find these people, to like scroll through TikTok and find some guy in African suburbs playing football very well and sponsoring him to go through school and to go through this, greatly diminishes. You basically lack the incentive, and even if you do, this will be very marginal compared to how much it is in the school. Second of all, we need to understand, basically I want to deal with the national pride point generally and how football generally affects us. Football is very, very important to Europeans. We have seen the streets of London and how terrible they look. after whatever that competition was. I'm not very good at football. We know that generally the people associate themselves during like during the Euros and World Cups, people associate themselves with the national teams. They also look at things like the Premier League and these national leagues to also see what they are. But more importantly, this is not just grown-ups who care about this stuff. We say that this starts at a very young age and you develop following the sport of football. This is the case for three general reasons. First of all, children generally follow games. This is better than playing video games where you have to like shoot at naked women, but rather you have like more, you basically you're more allowed by your parents. They're encouraged. This is sports. This is generally you being active and whatnot. Children play at school. This is like schools compete with each other in football. Therefore, like sort of like the clout that you get at school as a young boy usually comes from you being able to participate in the sport, which in most European countries is football. People like Ronaldo, Messi, and De Bruyne are authority figures and role models. And we know that they affect the behavior of those children, at least to some extent, because they participate in community activities to show what the people should act like. They donate to charity, they appear with impoverished kids on TV and teach them how to play football. They sing national anthems with them at big competitions to show exactly, essentially, what to direct this behavior generally. But even if not, we can still understand that there is a certain degree of behavior that just comes from you being exposed to the sport to such an extent that this forms at least some role of your behavior. The reason why this changes is because of what your local team, and what the teams you associate yourself with looks like. Because this means that because most European countries are more or less homogenous in who like the national of that country is. But if your league takes part, if in your league there are Brazilian players who don't look like you, they look like you, this means that when you go to school and see a South American kid, he no longer view himself as you view him as a foreigner. This means that at least to some extent, we need to understand that there is at least some change in behavior in which you see like more POC people, or you see people who sound differently like I do, or you see people who generally like, differ from you. You're less likely to focus on the national pride, being national pride of the person of what I look like. Therefore, it's just generally like self-esteem things for these kids, the ability to sort of believe in themselves and so forth. This, I'm now coming to the point of what the OG says to you. The reason why we say this is incredibly specific to these communities and why this matters is because to be from Manchester or to be from a certain locality doesn't mean necessarily that you have to be from there. To be associated with them, you don't have to be from there. The fact that De Bruyne plays for Man City means that Man City people associate De Bruyne with them, and they form this collective sort of identity with them. This means that this doesn't necessarily break what it looks like, but taking these players away from them and then not being able to assimilate into these groups, generally takes this away from local people. But furthermore, we're going to say that like giving better football for these people would generally just be better for them and would contribute to them and would do all the discrimination stuff that OG tells you about, because if we just are able to scout for talent more, we're able to produce better players. This is very intuitive. Therefore, the community will sort of like this more. Talking about the lower leagues and youth development issue, beyond what Rohan tells you, you need to understand that there's like beyond what the big teams already sponsor youth development and these lower teams in order to sort of create. We need to understand that in both cases that we present to you, there is a degree of youth that we try to direct ourselves at. Either this is local teams or this is the youth sort of somewhere in Brazil. The thing is, there is a very easy comparative of why this is important. I don't actually give a shit what Arsenal has or like how they develop or like who they benefit and so forth. What I do care about is that some guy in Brazil, if he isn't able to succeed in football, will not be able to succeed generally because of how like the state operates, because of the resources they have. If a guy outside of London doesn't succeed in football, he'll be fine. He'll graduate school, he'll go to university, he'll have a job, and he'll be fine. We're saying it's very specific to these people. This is a unique way for them to get out of this sort of trap that they exist in the status quo. Therefore, they're a much more significant group. National pride, we can have national pride anyway. Generally weighing this debate, you need to understand that the best case that OG presents you is national pride that gives you like good feelings and clubs being sort of happy, that doesn't actually provide you with any tangible input that we can compare this with. We're giving you mobility as a social and the mobility international for people who need it the most. Our worst case, that there is at least some underprivileged people who are receiving much more rather than, slightly less privileged people in the same European countries that are already wealthy in themselves. This means that we're protecting a much more significant group through a very unique avenue, which is not the case on side golf. For that reason, very proud to win from OO.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I'd like to invite on the member of government to open up that house.
First thing I want to talk about is the way in which that helps players who are foreign and play European league, right? Notice this clash with a lot of what opening opposition tells us here in terms of the hate that they're likely to face. Because I think realistically, the DPM or DLO does do a very good job at explaining often the culture surrounding football within these countries. That's to say, there's often quite a lot of racism to people that don't come from your country in the first place and play for your club. The reason for this is because of all the national and regional pride that all themselves say exist within these clubs in the first place, right? The fact that you're so culturally tied to the club and from the area you come from, you're more likely to hate on someone that doesn't look like you, or more likely to hate on someone that doesn't come from your area and is playing for your club. But I also think there's just a general culture of hate within football, right? Historically, you can see this with lots of different ways in which clubs have often fought against each other. There's been a lot of violence associated within football. And what this means is there's just a general level of somewhat more acceptance within racism within football, right? I think what this means is often foreign players who come to European leagues end up facing a lot of hate here. And I want to note this is really important, right? Because I don't think it's just like the really big star players you see, the really big names, Messi, Ronaldo, that come to European leagues. I think there's also lots of other players that are much, much smaller in terms of their recognition and in terms of their name that also come to European leagues. And these are the players that are most likely to get shot on, no thank you, because they don't have the same level of reputation, the same level of star prize attitude towards them. Why does this change then under our side of the house? I think realistically, first of all, the average quality of a foreign player under our side of the house is just far higher. And the reason for this is that you have to be far more selective over the types of foreign players that you choose to have within your club, right? Because you have a limited amount of money and capital to be able to buy players, right? And because you just have a limited number of slots here. So what this means is, A, you probably go for the bigger names people, the people that are the Messis and Ronaldos, right? Because they're always the better players. But secondly, you probably just choose players that are genuinely better skilled as a whole, right? Because they're always going to be something added and additional to your team. Especially if the players in your current team, like from your own country, are just weaker in general. It's especially important to choose the most skilled players from abroad. What this probably means then is that these foreign players are less likely to fuck up, or less likely to make the mistake. They're just better on the pitch. They play better football. And this is really, really important insofar as it probably decreases a lot of hate. But the second mechanism for this is I think players of your own nationalities on the team are probably just comparatively worse, right? Because now you have a better proportion of players that are from your local area, but they're probably just worse players, no thank you, because they haven't been developed as much, because they just aren't as good, they're just there to fill some level of quota, right? And what this means is foreigners aren't blamed as being the issue on teams. So when issues happen in football games and someone doesn't score, or there's a bad pick or whatever, I don't know anything about football, but realistically, what this means is it probably doesn't look as if it's a foreigner's fault, but rather people from your own area, right? So I think that in responding specifically to OO, the reason then that they say racism stops is because you see people from a different ethnicity on a team, and therefore you're far more likely to be nice or school child or whatever. But what they don't consider is that these are the people that are far more likely to blame for fuck up, especially when you have a predisposition and a bias towards hating on them in the first place. I think then comparatively, we're able to far greater decrease hate under our side of the house, because the players that are from foreign countries are actually very, very good on these teams in the first instance. So one, I think this means that the players themselves are just harmed less, right? So they're just less likely to receive this sort of hate and vitriol online. They're less likely to receive threats from fans because they are just far better in the first instance. Secondly, I think fans of that nationality in the first place are just harmed less. Because if you're a fan that goes to, if you're a fan that's maybe emigrated to a certain area, and you sort of happen to have a nationality of a player that's from a foreign country playing in that league, right? And you go to a game, you're the most likely to be heckled at after a match. You're the most likely to get beaten up after the game when you're walking home because you look like the player that might have fucked up in that game, right? I think it's a massively benefit your fan experience in the end. But I think thirdly and lastly, you probably just have a better culture within football, one that is less hateful, one that is filled with less sexual. I think it's also increases the level of engagement people have have in football in the first place, because it's not being such a violent and brutal place to be, where people are just like shat on because of the way that they look in the first instance. No, thank you. Right. The second extension then I want to talk about is why this helps the countries which players are likely to leave in the first instance, and why their football circuits develop in a way that's really, really beneficial here. Because I want to note that, like, I think a lot of players like that would come over to Europe would probably, on the comparison, just stay at home in the first instance. There are a couple of reasons for this. One, I think because the European leagues are just richer in comparison to any other league within the world. Right? That's to say that there are very few countries elsewhere in the world that actually have a football league of the same level of caliber. Right? So the Americans don't fund their football like clubs because it's just not a sport that's of any prominence in the USA, and plenty of other countries are the same extent. Like football is a uniquely European thing in terms of like a lot of the fan culture around it. But I think secondly, the European leagues are just far more reppy. That's to say that other leagues might exist, but they are way less reppy. Right? You don't get nearly as much money, you don't get nearly as much kudos or credit when you play in them. Right? And I think thirdly, like. So far, there are other leagues that exist, and they're also further away and less good, right? So maybe the comparison about Saudi Arabia exists, but realistically, a lot of players, one, don't want to play for a league that's often involved with a lot of like issues, a lot of ethical and moral issues, because players aren't just like bad people that just want money. A lot of them actually have some level of morality here. But secondly, it's like so fucking far away. It's an entirely different lifestyle. You have to give up a lot in order to play in these leagues in the first place. And like a lot of players are unwilling to do this. So I think what's likely to happen is there are a good number of players that will just stay in their own country. No, you don't have to put this as every single player, but a substantial portion of players that could be playing in leagues within Europe will just stay within their own home country in the first place. This is really good, but before that, I'll take opening actually.
Your plan to dunk the EDL and anti-immigrant sentiment if they don't belong and aren't good enough. Just take them all off the teams, make them do extra tests because of where they want, then kill all the investments in the country and hope they will somehow create the money themselves.
So we'll get on to the stuff about investment because this is like directly cashing with you here. But I think realistically, the type of hate that you want to talk about here is just far worse under your side of the house when they're on these teams and when they're being shafted in the first place. When they're just better players from other nationalities, you probably respect those other nationalities to a far greater extent because they're better at playing the game that you love so dearly. Right? Talking then about why this is good for the countries that players leave. I think the main thing here is that clubs within these countries just improve to a far greater extent because they now actually have players that they're able to keep in the first place. They have better players within their home nation, right? What this means is the level of football within these nations just improves exponentially, right? Because they actually have good people playing the game. I think what this means is that the experience of fans is just far more enjoyable within these countries, right? They're actually watching good football games rather than being left with the most shitty players within their country because all the good ones fuck off to Europe, right? I think it's incredibly important because talk about how inspirational football is, but I think realistically football is most inspirational for those people that are in dire poverty, that don't have very much in the first instance, and therefore look up to people from like their era that have risen to some level of prominence and are actually good at playing the game. I think you're far better able to see inspirational players as like a poor child and I don't know some countries like South America, that players actually playing in like a stadium near your house rather than a million miles away. You have to watch it on television and you might never actually get to see that player. But I think the second impact here is that more people just watch games within these poor countries to begin with. So more people from like the home area are likely to actually go and watch these games because the football is just better, it's more exciting to watch, and you have some nice players playing them. But I think other people from around the world are more likely to turn into these leagues as well, right? So if, I don't know, you're from Britain and you particularly like a player that's now stuck in South America playing, you're more likely to engage with that league than the first instance, watch their game. I think just drive up revenue in terms of the amount of money the stadiums are able to make, in terms of the amount of money the clubs are able to make in general. And this allows for greater development within these countries in the first instance, right? Because I don't think all can rely on nice like European leagues just giving them lots of money. I think there has to be a ground up movement, and this is the best way in which it's able to get this within these developing countries. For these reasons,
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. Now inviting on the member of opposition to open the case for CO. Here.
Building on.
Tell them to shut up. Closing opposition's extension is painfully simple. It's that this just lowers the quality of football. And this is really important because there are often games where both teams play badly, one team wins. It might well be a high stakes game, but both sides' fans are completely miserable because they've seen an embarrassing performance on the pitch. And likewise, there are often losses that teams' fans are happy to take. But also, just to, I'll impact this further, but the key thing to note here is the quality of football is what matters in terms of impressing fans, in terms of gaining fans, and in terms of retaining fans. So how is it that this model makes football far worse? First of all, it means that there are far fewer good players available for these leagues. And this is particularly painful if you're talking about English teams in lower leagues. If you're talking about countries that have leagues in countries that just aren't particularly populous, because this debate isn't just about Germany, it's also about Greece, it's also about the Netherlands, it's also about Norway, which aren't swimming in surplus pools of great footballers, and where you actually do really need to bring in people from overseas in order to plug the gap. Second of all, there is far less ability to choose players to fill specific niches. Often teams' play strategies rely on very specific skill sets of people in specific positions. Often you want a really muscular centre midfielder who's able to control the middle of the pitch. Often you need a wing back who's able to hit long balls up to attacking midfielders. You can see, for instance, often teams really struggle throughout a season as they cycle through people in the right mid position until they finally hit someone and their system works. And we would know, and so sure, you have 6 foreigners, but what if they're all plugging other gaps? This means that often, if you're just really limited, there might just be no English person that is good enough to fill this role, and that means that you're unable to play a really interesting and good and highly successful play system. Third of all, you have far less development of players. This means, scouting is expensive. It involves taking a lot of risks. And what this policy does is it decreases, but it means there are far higher risks. Because on our side, if someone's the 7th best foreign person on your team, that's still a great payoff. Whereas on their side, if they're the 7th best, they're just not worth taking. But also we would note it's simply not worth it for academies in outside Europe to operate. Opening opposition talks about how clubs in Europe have operations outside Europe, and I think this applies in at least some cases, but opening government successfully says that this probably isn't that many. We would note that often what funds come, for instance, clubs in Mexico or Morocco, is that they have academies that are able to develop people and are able to sell them off somewhat regularly in order to get a very secure revenue stream from wealthier clubs. And so this means there is far more development of players, which support those clubs outside Europe, but critical by giving them a stream of money, but also at the same time means there are simply better players available in Europe and for other leagues generally. And quality does make a difference. This is why in Australia, people don't care about the A-League and they get up at 3 a.m. to watch the Premier League. It's not because they feel more connection to the people on the field, it's because they're just playing fucking good football. And we would note that just as bad football is miserable, great football is thrilling. When you see their athleticism and their talent, when you see some novel or innovative system get pulled off and you see a team rise to the top. And it means that people are far more likely to get into it when they're able to see these insane highlight reels of team goals that are simply impossible to execute or executed far less on-side government. So, how does this affect different kinds of leagues? The European leagues, the sort of A-tier ones, like the Serie A or Bundesliga, we would note that, you want to see the best of the best playing there. You don't want to see them playing around weaknesses, where they've got a few German duds in their squad, and they've sort of got to play more on the right than the left. You want to see them free to play as creatively as possible. And opening government says, well, at least the fans get to have some sort of connection. But I think, first of all, I think this more than compensates for the connection. There's no use being connected to someone if you see that they are plainly the weak link of the team and you want them dropped every moment of every game. But second of all, the vast majority of fans aren't local. There are so many more Manchester United fans in Korea or Bangladesh than there are in the entirety of England, not to mention Manchester specifically. And so this means that people just generally get to enjoy these leagues so much more. Now to talk about B-tier European leagues, and these are the smaller countries that I mentioned earlier, like the Netherlands or Greece or Norway, and we would note that they're best overseas anyway. They're not retaining their very best. And so now what happens is they have to have they sort of have to pull far more deeply from the pool of mediocre players that wouldn't otherwise have contracts. And this means that, sure, maybe they can maintain their diehard ultra fans, but it means that they have far less appeal to their families or just to the casual fans in general. And it means that those leagues just slowly decline in quality. They have far less operation in order to develop new players. And we'll note that this is at least half the population of Europe. These people are also connected to their teams. They also deserve a good game when they turn up. But finally, talking about clubs outside Europe, we would note, first of all, they now have far more money. As before, they're able to sell players to European teams, and critically, they're able to sell more players, and there are more bidders for each of those players, which means they just get a lot more money. And these are the ones that don't have great, streaming deals or whatever. These are the ones that are actually in a lot of need of money. Second of all, they get a lot more fans. If you look at, for instance, South Korea, they have their football league really benefited from JS Park going to Manchester United, because these people were like, holy shit, there's a Korean at United, and that got them into football, and then that ended up boosting support for local clubs there. And so this means you just have more fans, and also at the same time, you have far better World Cup teams performing. Third of all, you have far more experienced players returning from Europe. So insofar as the connection is most important, we think people being connected to their teams in their part of the world is just as important. We deliver on that better, opening.
The number of quality players is not fixed. It's dependent on training and experience. There's a collective action problem, which means in many of these countries, you don't even train all but the absolute stars who are 16, 17.
I mean, it's very easy to be like, all like nurture's better than nature, but this just isn't true. Like, there are prodigies in football, and those are the great ones. But also, like, that just serves to show that natural talent is a very big part of it. So sure, you can train people up from a lower base and they'll end up being pretty good, but they're just worse. And that's bad. And we show that each margin actually does count. Finally, on direct rebuttal to closing government. The first thing is about how this decreases racism because foreigners play better football. I think, first of all, this isn't where racism comes from, right? Often, people from minorities are the best on the team, and they're the ones who get the most vitriol. If you look at, for instance, the hated Balotelli cop, it wasn't he was bad at football, it was because of his personality or specifically the color of his skin. But we would note at the same time, on their side, they now hold these people to way higher standards than before because they're one of the very few foreign players they can have. They're so much more susceptible to being hated. But second of all, the policy sends explicitly xenophobic messages. It says that, you can't say Germany for the Germans, but you can say the German football teams for the Germans. And it sends the message that these foreigners are taking up spots that belong to locals. It perpetuates this sort of bad messaging. And finally, the stuff about how it helps other countries' football, I think I've already flipped that because we get more money, we get more eyes, we get more local fans, and that's why this debate has to fall to closing opposition.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. I'd like to call upon the government whip to close off the case for vote that chair here.
This debate means a lot to me because I could have played for Celtic if it wasn't for all of the other foreigners who were taking up those spots. Okay, sorry. Right. Oh shit. I have my own, so I'll be okay. Hang on. I'm so sorry. I have a piece of paper. It's gone missing. That's fine. That's fine. Yeah. Okay, the first thing I want to do is clarify whom we owe the greatest obligation to. Then I want to talk about the impact of the extension on the development of developing football countries, and then I want to do a comparison with each team individually. So, on to whom do we owe obligations? Because top half teams have this idea that we owe particular obligations to fans, and the reason that they give for this is that those are the fans who have been responsible for your success because they've gone to your games and so on. Now, the problem is they've already got their money's worth when they got to see the games and when they bought the merch that they paid for and when they got to support your club, right? So, for example, if you're a shopkeeper and like people in your community come and they buy your stuff, you don't then owe some additional obligation to prioritize them over everyone else because you've literally sold them the stuff and they entered into a voluntary agreement with you. I don't think such an obligation exists. But who you do owe obligations to clearly is people who you've wronged, right? Because or even if you haven't explicitly wronged them, just people who you've done some sort of harm to, insofar as like it's generally good to make up for it. And even if you think that both obligations exist in this case, it's intuitively clear that that you have a stronger obligation to people whom you've wronged than just the people whom you benefited from. So, for example, if I've stolen £100 from someone, I owe the greater obligation to pay it back to whomever I've taken it from than to give it to my parents, even though everything I have I owe to my parents. And that's because that's just like restoring the world to the correct moral track that it ought to have been on. Even if I didn't steal the money, if I just found the £100 lying on the ground, I still ought to give it to whoever owed it from the same reason, right? It's the same analytical reason, that is restoring the correct moral track. What that means is any obligation which we can show that the countries the clubs in Europe have either whether deliberately or not deliberately fucked over by sucking up all the best talent is a far stronger one than any one that they owe to their own fans. So for that reason, I think we're going to win. And I also think you presumably owe, to the extent that you do owe obligations to people who have helped you, presumably the literal players in your team are more important than the fans, right? Because they're actually their whole livelihoods. They've given all the labor rather than just like a few of their money and like some of their time on a Sunday afternoon. So in any case, we would still have the greater obligation to players. I think for that reason, alone our case is the most morally salient in the world. Now I want to explain the impact of clarifying the impact of the extension on in terms of these other countries. The point is, when you have more money, then obviously you're able to do all of the development things the other countries want to talk about, right? So that's to say, you can invest more in your like pro youth team, so you can have more people, whether like in Brazil, getting into that, right? And you're going to have more money, as Zainab explained, because more people are going to want to watch that football, because probably to some extent the edge better football more enjoyable in the same for the reasons that they bring. What this means is we actually do get more better football circuits overall, but as well as that, we're able to get ones which are more tied to the community. To the extent that you care about quality, you presumably also care about watching something which is from your local community, as other teams agree. But we're able to fulfill both of those burdens with our extension because you're getting to see local football, which is also the best football, and that is something which applies to most of the world isn't Europe, and most people don't live in Europe, guys. So that's probably quite important. No thanks. I might find it in my heart to take this later. Okay. Now I want to deal with. Actually, I'll deal with opening government first. I want to wear a case against theirs. So I've already explained where our impact is the more morally salient one, but I want to explain why even in terms of the quality of football, we're still, or even in terms of their things, we're still able to maximize impact in the way they are, and that's for a number of reasons. The first is in terms of the weighing is uncertainty, right? So notice their impact isn't on their outside primary impact is about fans caring about the particular players, not the actual quality of the players, right? And the mechanism that they give for this is the people who you've grown up with, you probably followed their teams in the development stages, and I would just say this is at least he didn't do enough work to show that through, and it's probably not extremely plausible because most fans they probably follow one club and therefore they follow the big club, and the reason why most people follow the big club is because they're big. So therefore, so that means that it's unclear whether that happens, but like. Yeah, right. It's pretty clear that people want the football. Very good. The second thing is on scale here, right? Because to the extent that there's the extent that like most people live outside of Europe, and Europe is like sucking up uniquely the biggest talent from these countries, then presumably we're just able to get more countries and more people able to access better quality football, and therefore maximizing over and above what opening government would like to say. The last thing clearly is in terms of the actors affected, because even if you didn't buy what we said previously about like these clubs having taken from these fans, it probably still is the case that the outcome matters more to people who are just not used to seeing their club winning, right? That means when their club is successful, it just means a lot more to you than it does when you see your club winning if you follow a European team that's typically successful. In terms of their national teams, I would say I would say that like obviously if they're just able to symmetrically improve the quality of all European national teams, it's not clear that makes anyone any happier. They still were able to improve the quality of national teams which haven't been as good before, and that's going to be something which is beneficial. But I think also offer a new and better mechanism on why you improve the quality of national teams, which is just that your players are more used to playing with each other, so therefore they're more familiar with the play style. On opening opposition, now I guess you should have taken us. Okay. I think we're already winning in terms of the discrimination stuff. But I would point out that they try to argue that you're able to limit the amount of discrimination in society. But presumably, like, that's the hardest impact to reach in this round. It's just like the actual discrimination which people they face. But we're uniquely able to bring you is that which the players themselves face and which like fans of the club face. And I would point out that okay, it may be true that the players who would have faced abuse are now going to not be in the club that they would want to go to. But that is a short-term harm when we tell you that in the long term, you're going to see more development of the league in the country that they came from, and therefore we're able to mitigate that in the long term in a way that they're not able to mitigate or impact. So I would say that even the players who are now saved from suffering this abuse and also on our analysis are able to, in the long run, play for a country where they feel more at home, which is probably an ancillary benefit as well. Okay, I now want to weigh against their idea that said where they claim that actually you're better able to develop these like you're going to get European countries like investing lots in these things. The first thing is I don't think this trade-off is real, and I'm going to do a bit more than Deputy Prime Minister who said that it wasn't real. I think the thing here is when you get the mechanism that they give, they said it's cheaper to build stadiums in poorer countries, which is probably true, but also you have to transport like all of your stuff over there. People there probably have like less time to play football because they need to earn money, and they certainly can't pay for like the equipment and these kind of things. So there are lots of other reasons why that's likely to happen, and therefore most of European investment is going to be in Europe anyway, and therefore they're not able to actually achieve their impact. But secondly, I think that even if they're right, the benefit of that training only goes to a very small number of people. That is, the people who get really good and then they go and they get the cash out when they get to go to Europe. Given that we are maybe able to deny those people some benefit, but it means that overall you get more eyeballs on the game when they have the star players that CEO say they care about, and therefore that means you have more money to invest on other people. And also like we've already won on the national teams, and we also explain why our impact is more long term than the short term suffering endured by people who don't get to go these best leagues, and for that reason I think we're taking out this impact. I want to do with the extraneous responses. Which closing opposition bring? I think firstly, I think they say the first thing they say is like this isn't actually the reason why this abuse is likely to happen in the first place. But I would say that presumably it just is because unless you've made a mistake, then you're not going to get many people who are penalising you for making a mistake. Right? It's just not clear at all how what they're saying is actually going to be something. Which exists. And I also just and therefore I think that we are able to actually ameliorate this problem for the better case. How to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. Now calling upon the opposition whip to close off both the off bench as well as the dais.
We good? Amazing. I want to be very clear on the importance of our case, because literally millions of people love and enjoy football. It is, for many people, one of the most important things in their life. Every week they look forward to the matches their team plays, and some build their lives around the importance of this activity to them. If we make this activity en masse worse on every level, at the highest professional level, right down to the local competitive level, that is just a huge negative impact to all of those people that needs to be credited in this debate. But also, all of the analysis in this debate around the economics that can be brought to different regions or countries depends on football being good enough for individuals wanting to invest in it. All of the analysis about football being able to change culture relies on people caring enough about the outcome of football matches to be able to make those cultural decisions. All of this is harmed if the government's policy is introduced, because you have fewer pools of good players to introduce to your teams, you have much less capacity to carry out the strategic decisions that Mark talks about, and you also break down the fundamental systems that have worked to allow individuals to get better at football. The responses we get to this are firstly in an opening government POI, which is that you will make all of the pools of players in your own country better so you still have good teams to access. Firstly, as Mark points out, there is this natural ability. Something I'll note OG concede at the top of their PM speech, when they said they'll need much more than 5 players in the team, because they won't know which ones will respond best to the training.
If it were true, as the opening government want to claim, they can just train up everybody to be good. They don't even need 5 players in the team. But also, I'd argue that there are just a load of structural reasons why this is more difficult. Firstly, you have to now split your scouting and funding in really non-intuitive ways. Because even if you know that what your team needs is something that is specialized in one region, you're forced to take far more people from a particular region that has different skills. Secondly, there's a much greater degree of intensity of competition for good players within your region, because all of the best teams in your country are competing for the specific group of good players within your country, as opposed to competing for all of the good players in the world. So by necessity, there are just fewer of them that you're able to access, even if they're all relatively good. Thirdly, I know that there are periodic drains that just get produced by the nature of the pressures that are on sports managers. Because if you're the manager of Arsenal, say, and there are some good players in the Scottish League Cup, your incentive is to buy them up now, use them for as long as you can, so that you get good results. And then when they're too old to continue playing, dump them. But that means that all those people leave the Scottish League Cup and don't have the capacity to train up other players there, or play against those players in competitive ways. Meaning that periodically, all of these sub-leagues are drained out. Something that doesn't happen on an international level because there are just so many different leagues that give you the possibility to invest in. All of which means that our argumentation about sport getting worse definitely occurs. Another possibly implicit response from opening government is that Saudi Arabian football will just get really good now because it imports loads of individuals. Thankfully, CG rebutted this for me, but I also know that is just a much smaller league that people have much less interest in a priori. So I don't think people are going to want to go to that happening. Why does this extend over our opening? Firstly, I would point out that we bring you a much more extensive impact in general in terms of the scale of people, but also on the non-European clubs that they care about. Because it's not just that European clubs pull their own training out, but that these countries lose the ability to develop their own self-sufficient ways of developing players, because they no longer have a continued stream of players that they can sell. Because it's not just, as opening governments say, that you buy the best players that they can continue to do on their side. It's that you buy mid-tier players and train them up from these countries, and that gives constant revenue to these other countries that allows them to build up their own leagues. Secondly, I'd point out that we actually show why their principle of choice is damaged on side government. Because both government teams question what you want from the team and who the relevant actor whose choice you need to care about is. Literally everyone who has a stake in football, from the fan on the street to the investor that owns it, wants football to be good. We're the ones who show this gets much worse on side government. Thirdly, we show that European leagues themselves are harmed, something that undercuts all of the impacts on side government. Because it's not automatically a good thing to play for Arsenal or Liverpool or Chelsea if that is not a fulfilling lifestyle, if it's not something that gets you good career opportunities afterwards, if it's not something that you actually enjoy doing and people actually care about. If we show that that gets much worse, even if they get more local English players into those teams, it is not a necessarily good impact. Finally, I would show you why we give you the real reason why culture gets worse. Because the teams are getting worse, there is more resentment for the players that cause the team to get worse. There's much less positive buy-in into the activity. On to closing government. They say that you get less backlash against foreign players. As Mark points out, you have more scrutiny on the individual players that do come when they inevitably make mistakes, because every person does. Then you get a huge degree of backlash. Secondly, you specifically politicize this issue. Because while it is true that some people who follow football are racist at present, it's generally accepted by most football fans that football is incredibly internationalized and your team is going to have a lot of foreign players. Now you introduce a new policy that puts a huge amount of scrutiny on who is a national player and who is a foreign player, and creates that distinction in the mind of far more football fans. Meaning, when the mistake happens, it happens as the foreign player, not just as a player for Arsenal or Chelsea. Next, I point out that the best players from these countries still come on our side. So the only thing that has changed is that they're now the only players that are coming. So there's a huge degree of pressure on every single player to be as good as them. Finally, I point out that this is good for individuals to get exposure to people from other cultures improving at activities and failing once, but then winning the league the next year. That also plays an important narrative purpose. Their second argument is that you make the leagues in non-European countries better because people stay behind. This relies on those leagues being good in the first place. Mark points out why you lose the mechanisms to make it good because you don't have consistent revenue streams from lots of players leaving your country. I'd also note that there's a huge incentive in these countries, if you're a good athlete, to just not go into football and instead go into another sport, given that most physical skills are transferable, because it's much easier for you to emigrate in another sport where there aren't restrictions and you're moving to Europe. Before I move on to opening government again.
Quality is a factor in entertainment and viewership, but not only one. Connection matters. Otherwise, why the hell people watch Man United for the last 10 years?
But also, it's not just people from Manchester that watch Manchester United, right? It's people all over the world. So clearly connection is less important than the quality of the activity, and that connection goes down the worse the activity gets. On the rest of the opening government material, they firstly say that you get better financing. I know that all they do is change the model of financing from one that splits financing between your own country and domestic regions to one that massively over-prioritizes your country, which en masse are the more developed countries that already have financing in other areas. They also say that you get youth development through bringing people in to B squads. This already happens to a large extent because it's very easy to get people from your local area into those youth squads and B squads because they're cheaper than people abroad. So all you're doing is cutting off access to those backup routes you're getting into football to people coming out of other countries. They also say that you still diversify your team. I point out that Mark is the person who specifically shows why even if you do this, it's harmful to non-European leagues because they need a constant stream of revenue from even mid-tier players. All of which means that those countries get worse, and the teams in the European countries get worse, and that football as a whole is ruined for the millions of people that it's incredibly important to oppose.
All speakers at debate, and before you all leave to the final round of the quarterfinals, please go outside to shake hands, and thank you, observers, for not interrupting.